Ladies and gentlemen, I invite you all to rise and drink a toast to President and Mrs. Trump, to the continued friendship between our two nations, and to the health, prosperity and happiness of the people of the United States.
Well, Her Majesty Queen Elizabeth II there, gracious as ever. But how did President Trump perform during his state visit? Well, there were no massive faux pas with the royal family, apart from telling the future king where to stand, and only a few niggles with Conservative politicians. For example, he clearly favoured Boris Johnson for PM. But no, the big clash came with the left-wingers, the leader of the opposition and the mayor of London, whom Trump called a stone-cold loser. But who started it? We'll get into all of that in a moment, but first, a quick 2-minute look at the 3-day visit.
President Trump is heading across the Atlantic for a 3-day state visit to the UK. The president will meet with members of the royal family and British politicians.
President Trump's historic state visit to the UK, the first day full of pomp and pageantry, the royal welcome.
He had wanted this visit, he had wanted this big state occasion, the pomp and pageantry of all the ceremonial stuff that the Queen can offer. He's getting that.
President Trump, the First Lady, meeting with Prince Charles and Camilla.
Then on to the tomb of the unknown warrior at Westminster Abbey.
President Trump was treated to a glittering state banquet.
An affair that perhaps only the British are able to put on.
A great, great woman.
Mr. President.
President Trump's state visit to the United Kingdom continues. In between royal meals, the president had a joint press conference with outgoing Prime Minister Theresa May.
I heard that there were protests. I said, where are the protests? I don't see any protests.
Thousands of protesters gathered to demonstrate against President Trump.
They even dedicated a statue to him.
Organizers have said that they estimate about 75,000 people were there.
Now, in return for Donald Trump receiving that royal hospitality and hosting a banquet himself.
It's the third and final day of US President Donald Trump's UK visit. It's going to be a busy day for Trump.
President Trump and Queen Elizabeth joining hundreds of veterans at a ceremony to commemorate the 75th anniversary of D-Day.
President Trump quoting a prayer that was written and read by President Franklin Roosevelt on the day of the D-Day invasion.
The president left for a round of golf in Ireland, leaving behind some cautious optimism and perhaps a sigh of relief.
Well, 3 extraordinary days, and we have 3 rather extraordinary guests to analyse all of this. Up there in the top left, Simon Marks, a British journalist who spent years covering American presidents and all things Washington. To the right there, literally and politically, we have Errol Moorcock, the chief strategist for Republicans overseas. And in the bottom screen, Britain's best-known commentator on the royal family, Dickie Arbiter, a former press secretary to the Queen. Now, we're going to get into all the politics in a moment, but first, let's start with the etiquette and the protocol. Dickie Arbiter, no one better to ask about this than you. How did the Trumps handle meeting the royals?
I think Trump behaved impeccably. There are those sceptics who thought that he wouldn't be able to handle it. Had a bit of a rehearsal last year when he went to Windsor Castle, but he did behave impeccably. The Queen is the perfect host. A lot of people suggest was there concern at Buckingham Palace over this visit. You've got to remember, in her 67 years, the Queen has entertained despots and dictators. Trump is neither a despot nor a dictator. So he did well, the Queen did well, and I think the whole state visit went off well.
Dickie, a few people would argue with you about that, but we're not going to get into that just now. Let me ask you about the royal household. They wouldn't have felt any apprehension about a man who likes to shoot from the hip and who acts quite spontaneously at times coming to visit them on a state visit?
Well, he is spontaneous and he does shoot from the hip, but I think he realised where he was going, who he was meeting, who his host was, and that he had to behave. I don't doubt there was any apprehension in the royal household. They've been used to dealing with heads of state of all persuasions. The Queen's been on the throne for 67 years. They've had something like over 130 inward state visits, that's state visits
Yes.
by visiting heads of state. So they've learned to handle. And
Indeed.
not only that, the Queen's met dictators and despots at Commonwealth heads of government meetings.
Now, let me ask you about two little incidents that the British press in particular picked up on. One was when President Trump directed the future king, Prince Charles, where to stand, and the other one was the very brief gesture of his arm going up during the banquet. Any major problems there?
No major problems at all. I mean, if you go back to when the Obamas came over here, President Obama had his arm round the Queen. So I think we've got to move on. The Queen's very pragmatic about these things. Americans are touchy-feely, they are tactile, and you've just got to accept it. The Queen's not upset about it. The British journalists were harumping in their gins and tonics. Politicians thought it was bad form, but the Queen takes it in her stride.
And Dickie, just to go back to that Prince Charles incident, or perhaps it was a non-incident, but he's not used to being told where to stand. How do you think that played with him?
That played all right. As I say, the royals are used to people not quite up to speed on how the royal family operates, what it does. I think more people outside of the royal circle get more upset about these things. The royal household take it in their stride. The royal family take it in their stride. That's the way outsiders behave, and you deal with it accordingly.
OK. Well, what's interesting is, of course, the president and the prince are quite the opposite characters when it comes to the issue of climate change, yet somehow their scheduled 15-minute chat turned into an hour and a half.
What he really wants and what he really feels warmly about is the future. He wants to make sure future generations have climate that is good climate as opposed to a disaster. I think we had a great conversation, and it was about, as you would call it, climate change.
Quite interesting. Let's go back to Dickie Arbiter now. Dickie, it's not usual for President Donald Trump to be the to admit that he had much less of the conversation than somebody else he's talking with. He said Prince Charles dominated. He did most of the talking. What kind of man is Prince Charles? Is he quite persuasive, charming?
Prince Charles is charming. He knows how to handle people. Again, like his mother, he's been handling people all his life, all his adult life. And when it came to President Trump, he knew where the president was coming from in terms of climate change. You know, it used to be global warming, now it's climate change. President Trump calls it unacceptable weather or something of that nature. I think they agreed to differ, but the Prince of Wales probably wanted to get his message across and probably did get his message across. Donald Trump had to accept it. OK, let's go to Washington now. We have Simon Marks up there. Simon, of course, there are many people in the United States who says wherever President Trump goes, he is an embarrassment on the world stage. How do you think he performed and the view from the United States?
Well, look, I mean, I think, Matthew, there's no question that this visit, in terms of the protocol, went off much better than many in the White House had feared. Dickie, I'm sure, is right that there wasn't much apprehension within the royal household, but there was certainly apprehension within the White House about how President Trump was going to conduct himself, because he is not a president anyone within that White House is capable of controlling. So he definitely, I think, benefited politically here in the United States from the scenes of pomp and pageantry, even though they were accompanied by a degree of petulance and peevishness on the president's Twitter account about a whole host of issues unrelated to the UK, and also, of course, about the Mayor of London, Sadiq Khan. But those images are going to be very valuable to President Trump as we head towards the November 2020 election battle here in the United States. His image makers will want to craft those images of the statesman-like Donald Trump in as many of his television and online advertisements as they can.
Exactly right. Let's bring in our Republican now, Errol Moorcock. Errol, you're a Republican strategist with Republicans overseas. Pick up on what Simon was saying. This is going to be gold dust for the president as he gets into campaigning for 2020.
Oh, absolutely. If you go back to the royal wedding, I believe there was more Americans who watched it than anywhere in the world, basically. So there was a tremendous amount of respect and gravitas that the royal family in the UK has that plays back home. So we were so excited to be welcomed for the event to go off without any sort of hitches or anything like that. Trump came for a state visit with the Queen. What a bunch of PC malcontents in Parliament or in the streets say doesn't really matter. Americans don't even know their names. So it was just a wonderful visit.
A bunch of PC malcontents. We're going to come back to them in a moment. They're quite important around here, actually. You know, a state visit was actually originally planned for last year, but downgraded to an official visit because of security concerns, apparently. A state visit, of course, is a much grander occasion, and very few are afforded such a privilege. So you can see why Trump was so proud. Once or twice a year, Her Majesty Queen Elizabeth II, on advice from the government, of course, invites another head of state for a state visit. It is a rare honour.
7 decades, the Queen's hosted just 112 such visits. Kings, queens, emperors, and even a Shah.
You'd think America would top the league with 3 visits. Actually, Saudi Arabia, Mexico, and Italy are on 4. And guess who's in first place? It's close neighbour, France. Now, usually, heads of state are welcomed at Horse Guards Parade and take a little carriage ride to Buckingham Palace. But because of security concerns, American presidents skip the ride and fly Marine One directly to the palace grounds. Guests would usually stay at the palace, but Trump had to settle for the US ambassador's residence. Nothing personal, but the Queen had decorators in. The highlight is surely the State Banquet and a toast from the Queen herself.
I'm delighted to welcome you and Mrs. Trump to Buckingham Palace this evening.
Compliments from the Queen and an opportunity to bathe in the royal spotlight. A politician couldn't ask for better publicity. Now, what to do about those pesky protesters? Well, the best thing to do is, of course, ignore them. Play it down. Protesters? What protesters?
I said, where are the protests? I don't see any protests. I did see a small protest today when I came, very small. So a lot of it is fake news, I hate to say.
There were protesters, though, weren't there? Organisers say 75,000. Many observers say barely 10,000. Either way, far, far fewer than last year, when close to 250,000 came out.
Donald Trump is the worst president of the United States there has ever been.
Racism, transphobia, misogyny, everything that I feel Trump represents, I'm against.
Trump says that in the UK we practically love him, but it's actually quite the opposite.
He's a nasty piece of work. He should never be in politics, let alone in charge of a country.
He's a liar, he's a racist, he's a climate change denier.
Let's go back up to Washington now. Simon, you are in Washington, but you're also British. I know you're keeping a close eye on things here. Has the British public warmed significantly to Donald Trump? What would explain the reduction in the crowd sizes?
Look, I think there's no question, Matthew, that there is a portion of the British public that supports Donald Trump. There is a, forgive the phrase, nexus that brings together, on many occasions, supporters of Brexit and supporters of President Donald Trump. They often come from the same political cloth. But there's something quite extraordinary about seeing a president of the United States deny the existence of 70,000 protesters in Trafalgar Square, insist that was all fake news, but then go on to claim that he saw, in his words, thousands of cheering supporters of his lining the streets, something that no reporter on the ground in London was able to witness. And that was one of many false statements that the President of the United States made during the course of his trip to the UK.
It was very interesting, Simon. I went down to Parliament Square and I could see the protesters. There was a very, very thin line of supporters who actually needed police protection. And there was another smaller group of perhaps you would say more extreme protesters who were saying, off our streets, Nazi scum. And I was asking them, do you know if they're Nazi scums? And they say, well, actually, we don't know. But that's par for the course, isn't it, Simon?
Well, it's absolutely par for the course wherever President Donald Trump travels. I mean, but what is odd is that, and unusual, is that he still doesn't have a way of rhetorically handling all of this without simply essentially lying about the existence of these protesters on the streets of various cities that he visits.
Let's give Errol a chance. Maybe when the president was saying fake news, meaning it was unduly amplified. Errol.
Well, I think just to try to clarify his comments, I was actually down at Trafalgar with a film crew to do a piece on that. And at the time, when he was going to come by, there wasn't really enough people. So we had to move over to Westminster trying to find the balloon, which was also not a very big protest. So at the time that he went by, it's very possible that he didn't really see very big crowds. And then he went down the middle of the lane and he saw the few people waving the flag. So I think he was just underwhelmed or unimpressed by what he saw at the time.
Perhaps because of security concerns.
There was more people there, absolutely.
Yeah, perhaps because of security concerns, he doesn't get the same view of things as we do, although he does assiduously follow it on the television, doesn't he? The star speaker at the protest in Parliament Square was the leader of the opposition himself, Jeremy Corbyn.
By our demonstration here today, we've shown just how determined we, all of us, are.
Mr. Corbyn had boycotted the State Banquet the day before, snubbing the president and enraging some of his own critics.
You can hang out with Hamas, you can hang out with the IRA, but you can't have dinner with the President of the United States. He happily went along, or at least he went along, to attend a state banquet in honor of the Chinese President Xi Jinping. Perhaps he ought to have a quick look at China's record of abuse of human rights and incarceration without trial and murder. All right?
Could be a fair point. Let's go to Dickie Arbiter. Dickie, I know you're very angry about the leader of the opposition boycotting the state banquet.
Yes, I mean, it's not just a snub to President of the United States, our closest ally. It's also a snub to the Queen. And as the leader of Her Majesty's loyal opposition, he should have been there. There's a lot of hypocrisy when it comes to Corbyn. On the one hand, he boycotted the state banquet, and on the other hand, the next day he asked for a meeting with President Trump. And President Trump quite rightly said no. And go away, sort of thing. No, Corbyn is a hypocrite. I mean, he'll condone some things and he'll agree with others. I mean, take the whole issue with the Labour Party at the moment of anti-Semitism. It goes on and on and on, and he does nothing about it.
Well, that's an interesting point, which I think I need to explain for our viewers. The fact is, Jeremy Corbyn's own party, the Labour Party, is being investigated by an organisation in Britain for allegations of anti-Semitism. So when he makes accusations against President Trump that he is making racist remarks, he himself is in a little hot water in the UK. Simon, can I come to you for a moment? Has this snub by Jeremy Corbyn even been registered by the American press and people? And if it has, did it cause great offence?
I think the answer to that question is no, really, Matthew. Jeremy Corbyn could pretty much wander down any American high street and not be recognised by the vast majority of Americans. He's not an ever-present figure on US television screens. But what has been noticed here in Washington by policymakers, and I was with one former State Department official last weekend who served in the George W. Bush administration, so no shrinking violent liberal, who said, why on earth are the British offering this kind of honour to President Donald Trump? Because he argued that it was tantamount to engaging in the normalization of an American presidency that is abnormal and far from operating along usual lines.
Well, we see Jeremy Corbyn as an anti-Semite communist who wants to basically nationalize British industry under market rates and have the British public eating zoo animals like his friends in Venezuela. So, I mean, we don't even recognize him. It's ridiculous that he disrespected the Queen and the visit to try to upstage it and bring himself into that.
Errol, thank you for that. Not the only one. Trump also had a row with another left-wing politician, the Mayor of London, Sadiq Khan. In a tweet from Air Force One, while still in the air, the president dropped a little tweet bomb, calling him a stone-cold loser. Well, that is after Khan wrote a very critical article in The Guardian comparing Trump to a European dictator from the 30s and 40s.
I'm a bit surprised that the president of the USA would, frankly speaking, behave like an 11-year-old and resort to name-calling. If he wants to have a discussion, and I'd welcome a discussion, about some of the issues that we disagree about, we should do so.
But, as you'd expect, Mr. Trump had plenty of warm things to say about conservative and right-wing politicians. About Mrs. May, for example, he said she'd done a great job with the EU.
Perhaps you won't be given the credit that you deserve if they do something, but I think you deserve a lot of credit. I really do. I think you deserve a lot of credit.
He also praised the country's leading Brexit figure, Nigel Farage, and held a banquet with him at the US ambassador's residence. And perhaps most controversially, he spoke in glowing terms about Boris Johnson, who's leading the race to succeed Theresa May as PM.
So I know Boris. I like him. I've liked him for a long time. I think he'd do a very good job. I know Jeremy. I think he'd do a very good job. I don't know Michael, but would he do a good job, Jeremy? Tell me.
Well, he made them laugh, but he's making other people very angry. Simon, some people have seen this as political interference.
Well, it's hard to interpret it as anything other than overt involvement in British affairs, and not just British affairs, but the affairs of the Conservative Party as it selects a successor to Theresa May as its own leader and therefore currently British Prime Minister. You know, usually visiting heads of government, former presidents from the United States who have visited the UK, go to great pains not to involve themselves in the internal affairs of the country or its currently governing party. That's not the case with this president. In that regard and in so many others, he's deeply unusual.
Did he step over the line, Errol, by saying that he liked Boris, he liked Jeremy?
I would say in a conventional political environment, the argument could be made, but with Brexit around the corner, Prime Minister Theresa May stepping down and Nigel's Brexit party taking over Europe, essentially Boris Johnson's a frontrunner for Prime Minister, and Trump came with a clear and present message that nationalism does not mean isolationism in the United States, and the same can be do for Great Britain. For our bilateral strength and our special relationship to be enhanced, especially with this new trade deal, we need people that we can work with. So in these special times, in this sort of populist, new changing world, the old playbook is kind of thrown out. Trump likes to sort of do that.
Dickie, were you offended?
No, I wasn't offended. I didn't feel that Mr. Trump should have interfered in British politics, but we're going through a very peculiar time at the moment. We're shilly-shallying over whether we leave Europe or not. Are we going to leave at the end of October? That remains to be seen. We've got a Prime Minister who leaves office on Friday. Who's going to take over? We don't know. And it's all about the UK doing business with the United States. Forget about the individuals. State visits are all about UK, United States. Trump is not going to be there forever.
Yeah, come in, Simon.
Yeah, but Matt, can I make a point about this trade deal? I mean, first of all, President Trump spoke completely falsely about the size of the existing trade relationship between the UK and the US and the potential size of the trading relationship between the two countries. But secondly, also in his comments about this fantabulous trade deal that apparently lies right around the corner, there is never any reflection of the political reality here in Washington, D.C. He can't even get his trade deal with Canada and Mexico ratified by Congress and therefore put into effect.
Good point,
the
Errol.
idea that a trade deal with the UK is right around the corner is absolutely fanciful.
Errol?
Well, the economic numbers show that the largest source of foreign direct investment in the United States is the UK, and the second largest foreign direct investment in the United States is from the UK. Cars, pharmaceuticals, oils. So that's jobs, that's pensions. So when you go back to the Congress, who needs to get reelected, even though they're so unpopular, they're going to have to tell their constituents that they're not bringing jobs for them because they hate Donald Trump. And it's going to be very hard to turn down what I think will be a very good deal for both our countries, because these are pensions, these are families that are going to be affected, and that's going to be votes.
Dickie, one last question. As a projection of Britain's soft power, this state visit that only really the royal household can do at this level, is it still important?
All state visits are important. All state visits are at the behest of the British government. They feel it's right politically, diplomatically. They want to do business with the visiting country. And when we're looking for all the friends we can get, assuming we do leave Europe, we're looking towards the United States. We're looking west in the hope the United States will do business with us. So you schmooze a bit. You schmooze the president, whoever the incumbent is. Trump's not going to be there forever. We're still looking long term, not just to the end of next year of the elections, not to the second election in 2024. We're looking beyond, long term. And if we can schmooze a president now, that we can do trade, do business, then so much the better. Then it's been worthwhile.
Dickie, thank you. Well, in all the talk about Trump and politics, it's easy to forget the most important event he was invited to attend, the 75th anniversary of the D-Day landing. Donald Trump was just one of many world leaders gathered in Portsmouth. You can also see Angela Merkel and Emmanuel Macron. 150,000 Allied troops set off from Portsmouth to begin the air, sea and land attack at Normandy that ultimately led to the liberation of Western Europe from the Nazi regime. Thousands were killed in the conflict, and now only a handful of survivors remain. But their sacrifice will never be forgotten.
Give us faith. Give us faith in Thee, faith in our sons, faith in each other, and faith in our united crusade.
It is with humility and pleasure, on behalf of the entire country, indeed the whole free world, that I say to you all, thank you.
Well, certainly a great occasion to remember. Well, that's all we have time for now. Just to our three guests, Simon, Errol and Dickie, thank you so much for your contributions to the Nexus today. And thank you for watching also. Remember, you can see this and all our previous episodes on our YouTube channel. But for now, and until next week, goodbye.